Okay, hello, welcome everybody. My name is Sergio Fickel. Welcome here in Cyber Hub 3. I'm from the Indo IT Club. We are a community of people with an Indonesian or Moluccan background, but most of us have also lots of IT experience, and especially as well in the cybersecurity space. And one of our missions is sharing knowledge. That's why we are here today. And I've got the honor to have Simon Leach here today. He's from HPE. He's the Director of Excellence on EMEA level, and he will tell you more about hybrid cloud, public cloud, and how to be resilient. So may I introduce you and give a warm applause for Mr. Simon Leach. Simon, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so first of all, thank you all for being here. I appreciate this is the last session in the afternoon, which means either you're really interested in the subject or your train doesn't go until 5 o'clock. But either way, I'm really happy that you've found some time to stay and listen to me. And my name is Simon Leach, so I work at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. I work on the internal cybersecurity side, so I lead our cybersecurity center of excellence internally. And my main role, or one of my main roles, is really speaking to the rest of the business and helping the rest of the business to understand why cybersecurity is important to them. Because we're a company that is full of technologists. We build stuff, whether it's servers or storage or cloud solutions. And sometimes security isn't the first thing that comes to a developer's mind. So one of the roles of my team is to help get that understanding across to the rest of the organization. And that's important because if we look at our company, we've got 68,000 workstations, 26,000 servers, 50,000 mobile devices, 13,000 network devices, and on a daily basis, they're generating 3.5 billion events and over 3 terabytes of log data daily. In fact, that's a little bit out of date because I was speaking to one of our team yesterday, and he told me at the moment it's about 6 terabytes of data daily. So we have to understand that data, and in addition, we're inspecting 174.5 million emails, 33 billion web requests each month, and automatically blocking 30% of those emails and 1% of those web requests. We also receive about 1,000 phishing emails a day. Now, a couple of years ago, that's where that slide would have stopped, right? But over the past couple of years, we've taken a lot of steps to adopt cloud, and in particular hybrid cloud. Obviously we're an infrastructure company, so it's always a bit of a delicate question as to what do you do in the public cloud, because we want customers to buy our servers and we can't be suggesting that we do lots of stuff in the cloud. But we have workloads in all of the 3 hyperscalers, over 800 accounts and 600,000 assets under management. So a huge amount of our data comes from the public cloud, but a lot of that space is developer-led activity. So it's not 600,000 assets that we deliver as services to all our customers, but a very large percentage of that is stuff that we're developing that isn't always under the control of IT. So we've also put over 2,000 continuously monitored security controls within our cloud estate to get better visibility into the activity that happens in that space. And when we speak to customers, they're all in a similar situation as well. So today's reality is that it isn't public cloud or private cloud, it's a mixture of both. We've got multi-generational IT, we've got workloads that span both the physical data center and the cloud-based data center. And the reality is that a lot of those workloads are never going to leave the on-site data center, because it's just some stuff we can't put into a public cloud. An example, if you're a financial institute, very unlikely that you're going to take all of your mainframes that are doing the processing of daily payments and putting those into the public cloud. If you're one of our customers is an autonomous driving organization, they gather so much data that it would be financially impossible to move that to the public cloud because it just doesn't make sense. So they still keep a lot of that stuff in an on-premises data center. So when we think about this from a cybersecurity perspective, any organization that has approached this from a hybrid perspective needs to also address their cybersecurity environment in a hybrid, with a hybrid approach as well. And that's really where this concept of cyber resiliency makes a lot of sense. So in the past, we would have spoken about cybersecurity, right? And cybersecurity is about putting up, gates and guards to keep the bad guys outside of our environment. But when you start to take an approach with cyber resiliency, you're accepting the fact that you will get breached, that you will have security problems, and that instead you build your system with the ability to anticipate, withstand, recover from, and adapt to adverse conditions to make sure that your organization will not go down when there's a cybersecurity incident. Now, an example of why that's important, a couple of years ago, the Colonial Gas Company in the US, they're responsible for something like 65% of all the gas delivery on the eastern coast of the US. They got infiltrated by a hacker who managed to release a strain of ransomware in their organization. It happened very simply. They'd left a VPN point unprotected. Somebody guessed a password. They got inside. The operational network was connected to the IT network. And as a result of that, it meant their whole network went down for a number of days. Gas supplies, so gas in the US is petrol. Petrol supplies were unavailable for a number of days. There was panic buying. The prices went up. It had a severe impact on the stability of the US economy because gas supplies went down and people started to panic. Now, had that organization taken an approach, a cyber resilient approach to that, they would have anticipated that sort of event from happening, and they would have had countermeasures in place to prevent that sort of impact on their organization. So cyber resiliency becomes a combination of not just cybersecurity, but also business continuity, organizational resilience, and IT disaster recovery. Now, the challenge we see a lot today is that those four teams within an organization, if they all even exist, remain very much in their silos. So having a good approach to cyber resilience is to get those people to start talking together. So I didn't mention it at the start, but there are going to be questions here. So I've got the first question. True or false? In the cloud, cost and performance is always prioritized over security and compliance. So hands up if you think that's true. So you all think, okay, one person. Everybody else thinks that security is always prioritized over cost and compliance.
Yeah, so based on my experience, I believe that because DR is expensive, most organizations would just focus on optimizing their costs and just making their infrastructure work. So anything that has to do with creating a disaster recovery backup site, they don't want to speak about that. That's why I think that's true.
Yeah, okay. And that's a very valid opinion to have, right? Because we all know security makes things more expensive. Typically, when I used to work in a pre-sales function, we'd sell an infrastructure deal, we'd add security on top of it, we'd increase the price by 10%. Now, does a customer want to pay 10% more because the environment is secure? That kind of depends, right? But the important thing there is that the security team gets involved early on in the discussion. So we did a survey last year, and we asked customers, how many of your teams or your security teams are fully or partially involved in ensuring security is designed into the hybrid environment? And the result that came back was 65%. And marketing looked at that number and they said, oh, that's great. 65% of customers are involving security when they build a hybrid cloud. And I said, yeah, but what about the 35% that aren't? Right, because security is such a table stakes thing today that there shouldn't be 35% of customers out there that are still not considering security when they build a hybrid cloud. And we also asked them some other questions. Why are the challenges around securing your environments? And there was turf and silo issues, previous slide where those four teams aren't talking with one another. There was lack of security skills, understandable, and it was some of the challenges around data and privacy regulations. But really the takeaway from this is that whenever you are building a hybrid cloud or anything in the cloud, right, as security professionals, it's kind of our responsibility to get in front of that project and ask the right questions. Right? I mean, if you attended Brenno's session earlier, it was all about asking the right question, right? And our right question to ask is, how are we going to secure that environment? And if the team shrugs their shoulders or say they don't know, then we've got a job to do. right? And that's one of the things that we get involved in a lot internally when we're looking at our own teams putting stuff in the cloud. Now, then often when you ask this question, it kind of brings up the next question, right? So when you migrate your workloads to the cloud, is security our responsibility, or is it the responsibility of the cloud service provider? Is that a true statement? So it's the responsibility of the CSP? Or it's a false statement? I mean, it's a bit of a loaded question because actually it's neither, right? When we move to a hybrid cloud, then recognizing accountability, in my opinion, is the most crucial aspect of moving to that hybrid cloud, right? Because there are some things that the CSP will have to do. For example, physical security in the data center, security of the platforms, security of maybe the hypervisors. But then there's definitely a lot of stuff that we will have to look after as well as the consumers of those clouds. And pretty much every CSP today has one of these, which is a security shared responsibility model. And I've put up the HPE GreenLake one here, not trying to sell it, but just as an example. And you can see here that basically depending upon the different type of workload, the responsibility or the area of the stack that the customer is responsible for is going to change. So when we're talking about bare metal, then basically customer does everything. When we're talking about an application as a service or a workload as a service, then really the only thing the customer is responsible for is the data that goes in and out of that solution. But recognizing that from a contractual perspective early on is really important and definitely needs to be part of the discussions you have when you're discussing SLAs with your cloud providers, and especially, and we'll talk about regulation in a little bit, but especially when we think about things like NIS2 or DORA, they're very much about governance and oversight and accountability. So if you don't understand who is responsible for a security function in your hybrid cloud, then you need to get that understanding, ideally before the contract is signed. Because typically, every time you look at the small print of a cloud contract, they're going to be very specific upon who's responsible when there's a breach. And in most cases, it's not the CSP, right? So making sure you've taken the appropriate steps to secure that environment is really relevant. But when we talk about clouds, a lot of the conversations that we'll have with one another are about the cloud itself and less about the users, right? So the next question is, does the role of the user have an influence on our security posture in the cloud? Now, what do we think? True? False? True? All agree with this one? Yep. Okay. Yeah. And yeah, that's very fair, right? And there's two reasons for this, right? The one reason is that one of the reasons that hybrid clouds or cloud as a general concept has become popular is because it makes it easier for us to work, right? A good example was COVID, right? Because many organizations had moved either their own workloads or the tools they use to the cloud. When COVID came along and we were all forced to work from home, it meant we already had a structure that was in place that allowed us to work from home. An example in our case, we were in the middle of a move to a sort of SSE, SASE type platform for our remote users so that we could control what websites they were visiting from their laptops, regardless of whether they were in the office or whether they were at home. All that COVID did was it accelerated the migration or the deployment of that platform and meant that we had a working solution a lot faster. But regardless of that, because of the nature of our organization, we needed to have a connectivity solution that worked well with the hybrid cloud. So it offered us capabilities both for internal applications as well as external applications. And a key part of that is around the identity of the individual, so identity and access management. And one of the key challenges that a lot of organizations have as they try to build resilient clouds is getting those identities into a single enterprise directory. So a lot of organizations, ourselves included, still have many usernames and passwords internally. But moving it all towards a hybrid model where you've got your single enterprise directory and you're using MFA, and whatever corporate application you want to connect to uses the same method of authentication and authorization, really starts to pay off a lot when you look at hybrid cloud. Then the next loaded question: the regulatory landscape has made it harder to protect my business when I'm in the cloud. Who thinks this is true or false? And this is a genuine question, because I'd like to know the answer to this. Has regulation made it easier for you as security professionals to protect your business? Who agrees with that statement? Nobody agrees with it? Who disagrees with it? Just to prove you're listening. Okay. Why do you think it's harder?
Yeah.
Why do you think regulation makes it harder?
Because in my business there's a big gap between the technical let's say employees and the business itself, and it takes a lot of effort to educate the business that it's also part of their responsibility, and that they're also involved, and not only involved in doing, but also in joining us with, for example, user experience.
Yeah.
And reporting back, because that's input that we need to, let's say, improve the environment. So it's in our case,
and I don't think the mic is working, so maybe other people didn't hear that. But I think the summary of that is that it becomes a challenge because regulation introduces new technical requirements, and it's hard to convince the business to adopt those technical requirements, if I summarize it. Right. Okay. Anybody else have an opinion on that?
I think that regulatory requirements are mostly generic requirements and maybe not be applicable, all of them, to my specific situation, but you need to apply to them, or you need to be compliant with them. So that makes it harder to protect, in the sense that you are forced to be compliant with, well, with regulatory or with controls that are not really adding value.
Yeah, so to kind of summarize that, the challenge you have is you have to start doing things that you maybe otherwise wouldn't have done, and it costs you money and it delays other projects. And I mean, those are both very valid opinions, because there is a lot of regulation that is out there. I mean, just a couple that I've picked up here. Yeah, as a US organization, we need to be compliant with the national cyber strategy that was put in place by US Executive Order 14028. But as a European organization, we also need to comply with NIS2. And because we're a regulated financial entity, because we lease computers to companies, that means we're a bank, we're regulated in Ireland. We also have to be DORA compliant. So there's a huge amount of regulation there that we need to be able to understand and comply with. And this is where it becomes an interesting discussion, because on the one hand, this is a huge problem, because I've now got just here 3 regulations and 6 different things, and each regulation has all these things, but each of them is slightly different. How do I handle that as a business? But on the other hand, you can take a more optimistic approach of that and say, well, actually, I've got all of these regulations that I need to comply with, and if I don't comply with them, I'm going to get a fine. And who likes a fine, right? Definitely the board of directors don't like a fine. Definitely leadership don't like to receive a fine. So use it as an opportunity to request more budget, and don't just chase DORA or NIS2 or whatever other regulation you need to follow, but create a security program that allows you to comply with not only these 3 things, but also any other regulation that comes along further down the path. The challenge we have here is that, okay, NIS2, all member states had to have something in place by the 16th of October. DORA, all financially regulated entities plus their ICT service providers have to be compliant by the 17th of January next year. That's fine. But what about the AI Act that comes in 2026? And what about the Cyber Resilience Act that comes in at the end of 2025? I'm not going to change my program again to meet with each of those. So the good news is that, yes, there's a lot of similarity between all of these programs, but the bad news is there's also a lot of dissimilarity. So take, for example, incident reporting guidelines. So there's just 3 here. National Cybersecurity Strategy, together with the SEC, requires us to report a material breach to the SEC. I think it's initially within 48 hours, right? DORA requires us to make an initial notification within 24 hours. NIS2 depends on the state, but that's probably going to be within 72 hours. That's just 3 regulations here. I've also got a Spanish one I've got to handle. I've got one in Chile I've got to handle. There's one in China. There's one in South Korea. There's 52 different ones in the US as well, because each state has a different incident reporting regulation. So that's just not manageable. So you have to look at the lowest common denominator and then build an incident reporting process that works for all of the regulations that you need to adhere to. The same thing with something like, for example, secure supply chain, right? Both NIS2 and DORA require you to be aware of the supply chain partners you work with. So, for example, if you consume services from HPE, then you need to come and audit us, or put the right in the contract to come and audit us. Whether you do that or not is up to you. But think about it, you're a bank, you've got 100 ICT service providers, and we supply to banks, and we've got 100 customers. That means we've got 100 customers coming to us to do an audit, but those 100 customers are also going to 100 suppliers to do an audit. Completely not manageable, especially if they also decide they want to do a NIS2 one, right? So we have to think about how do we approach that to be able to demonstrate our compliancy to regulations, and look at different approaches to doing it. So look at pooled audits, for example, doing your own audits and making those available to customers. Or taking a more standardized approach when you go to the vendors you work with. An example, I had a customer yesterday, not a Dutch customer, who came to us because they wanted to audit our internal IT. And he was an Austrian guy. So I found out yesterday that Austrians are almost as specific as Germans, right? So this guy, he said, right, NIS2 says you need to have a data sanitization program, and you need to have a media destruction program. I said, yep, we've got those. Of course we've got those. Here you go. Here's the documentation that says it. He reads it and he says, that's not good enough. I said, why not? Well, it's not good enough. It says, yeah, it says here for your data destruction that you destroy the disk by slicing, by shredding, by pulverizing, or by setting fire to it. I said, okay, that's good enough, right? The disk is destroyed. He goes, yeah, but how many particles? What's the particle size? I said, what do you mean, the particle size? He goes, well, how small are the particles after you've burnt the hard drive? I was like, oh, does that matter? He goes, yeah, because if they're not small enough, I'll be able to take that hard drive and put it back together. And I was like, right, can you show me in NIS2 where it says that I have to burn my hard drives to create particles that are this small? Sends me a web link which had nothing about that at all, because, as you said, things like NIS2, they put in a bunch of technical requirements, but they're not specific. And that's the challenge. That's a challenge, but also a blessing with all of these regulations, is that when they talk about things like improving security architecture, what they're really looking at are best practices, right? So that's the reason that things like DORA and NIS2 have not said things like, you have to pulverize hard drives to this bigger particle, because it's not relevant. If you're following best practices security, if you have things like an ISO 27001 certificate for your organization, you're already doing very well with all of these regulations. So the same for your suppliers. Look for these minimum level of security. Don't spend 3 days on the phone with someone to do an audit, because it doesn't help either of us, right? So that from a regulatory perspective, yes, regulation does make it hard, but yes, it also makes it a little bit easier, because it gets better visibility into the business of the reasons to be secure. So then, I think a final question. So was there a question? No? Okay. Final question. Security executives are more worried about ending up in jail than they were 5 years ago. Who agrees with that? Nobody? Who's a CSO in the room? Any CSOs in the room, or security leaders in the room? No? Okay. So, if I was a CISO today, I'd be really concerned about going to jail, right? And there's a couple of reasons for this. So, the first reason is that previous slide, right? So regulation. So something like DORA Again, DORA applies to the financial industry, so if you're not a bank or a provider to the financial entities, less relevant. But DORA not only fines the bank a percentage of their annual revenue, but it can also put a fine on an individual. So say, for example, our bank got breached, and I was responsible for the security of our bank. The Central Bank of Ireland, which regulates us, could turn around to me and say, hey, hold on, you didn't follow the appropriate best practices you said you were going to follow. We're going to fine you, Simon, €1 million. Well, I'd kind of be worried about that, right? And that's the concern that a lot of these security executives, CISOs, have. So just to kind of illustrate that, I asked ChatGPT to create me 3 headlines, right? And these are 3 different situations. So the first one, shareholders launch legal action against the CISO in wake of a data breach, seeking accountabilities and damages. Now, what happens typically after a breach? Share price drops, right? Example of this was with SolarWinds a couple of years ago, where the SolarWinds stock price ended up going down, and shareholders tried to launch a class action against Tim Brown, who was the CSO, based upon what they said was malpractice within his cybersecurity organization. The second one is SEC initiates criminal prosecution against the CISO for alleged security violations, unraveling the legal web of cybersecurity mismanagement. That's also starting to happen. In fact, in SolarWinds' case, exactly the same thing happened as well. SEC really took SolarWinds as a sort of a poster child example, because they went to SolarWinds and they actually started investigating not only all the emails that had been sent within the company prior to the breach, but also the personal text messages of people like Tim Brown, the CSO. And they discovered in those text messages that he'd made off-the-hand comments to some of his colleagues, saying things like, yeah, if we were to ever get hit by a breach, we'd be down in minutes. Well, it was said as a joke, right, to the guy that led the vulnerability management team or something, because there was a whole bunch of vulnerabilities the guy hadn't patched. SEC looked at that and said, hey, you knew that your security was substandard, so we're going to hold that as part of our case against you. Third situation, board of directors rallies in defense of the CISO amidst cybersecurity challenges, reinforcing trust and commitment to cyber resilience. That's the one we'd like to see, right? And that only happens if, when we talk about our cyber resilience, we create board awareness. And one of the good things with both DORA and NIS2 is that they do that, because in both of those regulations, there's a requirement. With DORA, the requirement is to have your risk management governance understood and audited by the board. And from a NIS2 perspective, it requires you to train the board on the concepts of risk management and cybersecurity and that sort of stuff. So then you start to get much better tie-in from the board of directors. But the challenge with the first 2 situations, from a CISO perspective, is that in most organizations, and it's the same in the Netherlands, you have this idea of board and officer insurance, right? So anyone that's on the company board or is an officer of the company, CEO, CIO, CFO, they have insurance that is provided to them by the company. A CSO has an O title, but is not a proper officer, right? So most of the time, the CSO doesn't have any protection from the legal board and officer insurance that the rest of the board and officers of the company have. So nowadays, when these CISOs are going for job offers, the first question is, what about my liability, right? If we were to get breached through no fault of my own, would you cover me? Would you give me the appropriate insurance? Would you back me? And it's a loaded question, because would I necessarily want to be represented by the same law firm as the rest of the officers, especially if it was my fault, or there was suggestions that it could have been me that was in contempt of that? So just a couple of the things that we've been seeing. So to kind of summarize it, the cyber resilient cloud, all of the stuff that we have in our on-premise organizations applies equally to our hybrid cloud, whether we're talking about private cloud or an on-premise cloud or a combination of the two. We need to make sure we have good oversight and assurance. I mentioned at the start that we had over 600 different accounts across 3 hyperscalers for HPE. When we started our work a couple of years ago, all of those 600 different accounts were monitored by different teams and paid for by different teams. One of the first things we did was bring them all under 3 corporate accounts, one at AWS, one at Google, and one at Azure, so we had better governance and oversight of that. But at the same time, we were also making sure that we're regularly reporting back to our board to make sure they understand the governance around our overall cybersecurity program. IAM, we already discussed that a little bit. Threat detection and incident response, very relevant, because a lot of incidents that we start to see now are starting on-premise, stealing an identity, and then creeping into the public cloud, using that identity to exploit assets, to stand up Bitcoin miners, those kind of things, cryptocurrency miners. If I've got that visibility to understand A, the theft of an identity, and B, how the identity is being used, I've got a lot better visibility, a lot better understanding of the environment.
And Simon, I've got the question.
Yeah.
If I look to all those requirements relating to the cyber resilient, and you're just talking about organizations still work siloed, because they need to share more knowledge and they need to work more together. How can they overcome the hurdles to be more resilient and to meet those requirements? Do you have any advice?
So I said at the start that 65% of customers involve security teams in their hybrid cloud design, right? And I said 35% don't, and that's the problem. The problem here is a bifold problem, right? So on the one hand, it's getting those guys or those teams to understand, hey, they need to be secure. But on the other hand, it's a role of the cybersecurity team to make sure that those teams know that cybersecurity exists. As I said at the start, one of my functions within HPE is to help the business units understand what they need to do to follow our cybersecurity policies. And that's because we have a decentralized security model. And that's the same with a lot of organizations. Our primary responsibility is towards enterprise IT and our users. So all of the applications that are in our data centers, that deliver customer services, etc., we protect those. But we don't necessarily have the visibility we need into some of the other areas like developer labs, for example. So we set policy and we expect those teams to follow the policy. So education is really good. Everybody talks about cybersecurity awareness training, but it's not just telling users not to click on phishing links or give away their login details or use weak passwords. But it's also job-specific cybersecurity training. So one of the things we do very well is we train all of our developers. I think 8,000 developers per year go through our cybersecurity for developers training, and that's a lot more than, hey, you must use passwords. It's teaching them about how to code securely in C++, how to use Python securely, how to manage a secure vault for your secrets and your passwords, all of those kind of things, so that when they build the software that we deliver to our customers, they do it in a secure manner, because our customers are expecting that. Yeah, and then I guess just one last comment. I think we're pretty much out of time, but just around backup and recovery. One of the challenges, and I haven't mentioned ransomware. I did mention ransomware once, that's okay. So, ransomware is one of the big things that challenges our cyber resilience, right? One of the problems, or one of the reasons that ransomware causes us such a problem is because we haven't thought about that from a resilient perspective. Yes, we do backups, but more often than not, those backups also get impacted when the ransomware hits us, just because of the ransomware, the way the ransomware works. So, advice is to look, again, it's about getting cybersecurity together with the other teams in the organization, but traditionally, we've always followed a 3-2-1 approach to backups, right? So 3-2-1 means three different copies of the data on 2 different media, and one of those copies being off-site. Now, with ransomware, you need to change that approach slightly, and rather than 3-2-1, we talk about 3-2-1-1-0, right? So 3-2-1-1-0 is 3 copies of the data still on 2 different medias, one still off-site, but one of those copies needs to be immutable, which means it can't be changed once it's been made, and there need to be 0 errors. And that 0 errors is the most important change, right? Because how often have we heard stories about companies that suffered an incident, went to restore the backup, and the backup actually stopped working 2 years ago because it got corrupted? right? So regular testing of your backups to make sure that when you actually have an emergency, you can actually replay the backup back again is a really important part of that overall disaster recovery approach, and also something that, again, going back to NIST2 and DORA, is very relevant there in your whole hybrid cloud, because they both have requirements around digital operational resilience testing, DR testing, those kind of things. So with that, here's my only slide to promote HPE. HPE GreenLake, our edge to cloud platform. If you're looking for a hybrid cloud, then that's a good solution to look at. I've done the salespeople a favor, and a couple of documents that you can download, which give a little bit more insight into the topic. One about how we've built supply chain trust. This is a thought leadership e-zine that we bring out every quarter, and the one on the right is from a very distinguished colleague in the US who wrote a white paper around edge to cloud cybersecurity. So if you want to take a photo of those or download them, then please do so. You'll find them if you just search on the names as well. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to take them.
Are there any questions? Yes, there's a question? Oh, no, sorry. Oh, go ahead. Take a picture. Oh, she has a question, yes.
So, I see that you use the word cyber resiliency.
Yeah.
I know that it's being sometimes interchanged with BCDR, that's business continuity and disaster recovery. There's a very thin line between the two. Can you just clarify based on your experience on how cyber resilience is different from business continuity and disaster recovery?
So the real difference between the two, and if you go back to like the second or third slide I had where I spoke about cyber resilience being this sort of joining of 4 different functions, then BCDR was kind of in that disaster recovery function. The real difference with BCDR is that BCDR is waiting for the problem to happen and then responding, right? Cyber resilience is about doing as much as you can before the problem to try to stop it from happening, but when it does happen, A, reduce the impact it has on the organization, and B, be able to respond efficiently. And that's where having a well-tested and well-formulated BCDR plan is really important in the whole cyber resilience process. You can't be cyber resilient without BCDR, but also you can't just do BCDR because you need to look at it as a combination of all of these different steps. That helps.
Did it answer on your question? Great. Well, thank you, Simon, for this presentation, and give him a warm applause. And also thank you for you to be here at the Cyber Hub 3 from the IT Club. So thank you very much.